Hi everyone, Teacher Janet here. Welcome back to my educational channel on biology. In this video, we're going to study or discuss subtopic 8.1 in the Form 4 Biology KSSM syllabus. So this is part 2 of the subtopic 8.1 because part 1 has already been done and put up in the YouTube, right? So for part 2 here, we're going to discuss the respiratory systems of frogs and humans. Let's get started. Now the learning standards are as follows. 8.1 Types of respiratory systems. So 8.1.1 we should be able to identify respiratory structures in four types of organisms. Insects, fish, amphibians or frog in this case, and humans. So in the first video which I've already posted on YouTube, part 1 concerns the insects and fish, right? And in this video, I already discussed the respiratory structures of these two organisms, insects and fish. So some of you asked me to carry on with the next video and also other videos for chapter 8. So here we have it. This is part 2. Okay, this is video 2 for subtopic 8.1. All right, so we're going to discuss respiratory structures in amphibians such as frog and humans. Secondly, we should be able to describe the adaptations of respiratory structures and their functions for gaseous exchange, right? So what are the adaptations of the respiratory structures? And what are their functions? The functions of the respiratory structures. So we're going to discuss the frog, respiratory structure of the frog and humans, okay? Their adaptations, okay? So the first one is to identify what the respiratory structures are, their names, and then secondly, the adaptations of these respiratory structures. And thirdly, the last part is to compare and contrast respiratory structures in humans and animals. That means we're going to compare these four organisms. Compare and contrast their respiratory structures. What are the similarities and what are the differences? So this is also included in this video. So our first learning standard is identify respiratory structures in insects, fish, amphibians, and humans. Now this slide has been discussed in the first video, 8.1 part 1, but we'll go through it again. So we have to again remind ourselves what is the respiratory structure actually, right? So the respiratory structure of an organism is the respiratory surface in that organism that enables gaseous exchange to occur between the respiring cells of an organism and its environment. For example, the alveoli in humans. So it's important to note that the respiratory structure is not the respiratory organ. Okay, it's actually inside the respiratory organ, usually inside the respiratory organ, and usually it's a structure that has a large surface area for gaseous exchange, right? In this case, in humans, inside the lungs, which are the respiratory organs, we have the alveoli, which are the respiratory structures. And we can see that the alveoli have a large surface area. They're small, round, but numerous. Okay, there are lots of these alveoli, so you will increase the total surface area for faster gaseous exchange. Okay, so the respiratory structure allows gaseous exchange to occur between the respiring cells of an organism and its environment. For example, oxygen from the environment is inhaled in and then it diffuses from the air inside the alveolus into the blood capillaries, right? So then it's sent to the body cells for respiration. So this is called the respiratory surface where the gas oxygen can diffuse into the blood of humans to be transported to the cells, right? Now, let's look at the various respiratory systems and respiratory structures of different organisms. So for amoeba, it does not have a respiratory system because it's a unicellular organism. For its respiratory structure, it just has the plasma membrane through which the oxygen will diffuse, all right, from the environment into the cell of amoeba species. And carbon dioxide will diffuse out from amoeba species through the plasma membrane into the environment. For insects, the respiratory system is called the tracheal system, and the respiratory structure are the tracheoles. For fish, the respiratory system is the gills, and the respiratory structure are the gill filaments, which are found on the gills, and the lamellae. So insects and fish have been discussed. Amoeba, insects, and fish have been discussed in the first video. Now we're going to discuss frog and humans. For frogs, the respiratory system is the skin and pulmonary system, and the respiratory structures, there are three respiratory structures, which are the skin, lungs, and mouth lining. We'll discuss that in a short while. And for humans, our respiratory system is just called the human respiratory system. For respiratory structures, we just have one, which are the numerous alveoli in the lungs, as seen here. So we'll be discussing 4 and 5, frog and humans, in this video. Let's discuss the respiratory structures of a frog. So here's the introduction. The name of the respiratory system in the frog is the skin and the pulmonary system. Pulmonary has to do with the lungs. So the frog has two respiratory organs, namely the skin and the lungs. Unlike most organisms which have only one type of respiratory organ, right? So the frog uses both its skin and its lungs here for to carry out gaseous exchange. So the respiratory structures are the structures where gaseous exchange actually occurs. Gaseous exchange with the environment. Okay, so there are three respiratory structures: the skin, the lungs, and the lining of the mouth. So the skin is used on land and in water. As you can see, the frog swimming in water here. So it uses its skin for gaseous exchange in water. And also on land. Okay, when it's resting on land, the skin is carrying out gaseous exchange with the environment, whereby oxygen diffuses into the blood capillaries and carbon dioxide diffuses out of the blood capillaries into the environment through the skin. Now, the lungs is used on land only, not in water, because if the frog were to try to breathe in water using its lungs, then water may get into the lungs and may drown. Okay, so lungs are used only on land, and more so when the frog is active. So it can use its lungs more often, especially when it's active, to get more oxygen, to obtain more oxygen for cellular respiration in order to produce more energy. Now, the third respiratory structure is the lining of the mouth. So it means the tissues in the mouth area here that lines the mouth. All right. So the mouth cavity is sometimes called the bucopharyngeal cavity. Okay. So when it's resting, this part here can carry out gaseous exchange with the environment. All right. Anyway, for textbook, we concentrate on skin and lungs. Okay, the lining of the mouth is not discussed as a respiratory structure. Okay, but the skin and lungs are the most important respiratory structures in the frog. Okay, so it has two separate respiratory structures, the skin and the lungs. Now, pathway of air to the lungs. So let's imagine that the frog is inhaling the air from the atmosphere. So the oxygen in the air will go through the nostrils into the mouth or bucopharyngeal cavity, and then into the lungs. And then when it's in the lungs, the oxygen will diffuse into the blood capillaries that are found underneath the lining of the lungs, in the wall of the lungs. All right. So how does a frog breathe? As you have said before, a frog has three respiratory structures or surfaces on its body for gaseous exchange with the surroundings. Firstly, the skin for use on land and in water, the lungs for use on land, and more so when it is active. That means it gets additional oxygen, all right, by using the lungs more when it is active. And in the meantime, the skin is still used for gaseous exchange, right, while on land. And the lining of the mouth cavity. So let's have a look here. Now, for the skin is always kept in a moist condition so that oxygen gas from the air, the atmosphere, can dissolve in the moisture on the skin. Okay, so the skin is kept moist because mucus is secreted by the frog constantly to keep the skin moist, and then the oxygen can dissolve in the moisture and then diffuse into the blood capillaries underneath the skin, which we cannot see here, right? And at the same time, carbon dioxide can diffuse from the blood out through the skin to the environment. Okay. Similarly, for the lungs, gaseous exchange occurs in the lungs where oxygen diffuses from the air in the lungs into the blood capillaries in the wall of the lungs here. And carbon dioxide diffuses out from the blood capillaries into the space here in the lungs. And after that, it will be expelled out when the frog exhales. Okay, and the frog breathes out the air. Now then you have the lining of the mouth cavity, these two parts here, where gaseous exchange can also occur. So oxygen diffuses into the blood capillaries around this area here, the mouth, and carbon dioxide diffuses out. Okay, so in the textbook, these two respiratory structures are very important. The skin and the lungs are mentioned, but the lining of the mouth cavity is not mentioned at all. Okay, so this is an extra fact. So let's focus on the skin and lungs. What are the adaptations for efficient gaseous exchange? Now here's an important question for SPM, can be asked in the SPM or exam. Describe how a frog's skin and lungs are adapted for efficient gaseous exchange. 7 marks. So we have to discuss both the structures or the adaptations of the skin and the lungs. So highlight the keywords: skin, frog skin and lungs, adapted. So when you talk about adaptation, you must have the fact and the explanation, or the characteristic and then the function. State the explanation. How does it function? How does it help in the help the process to be carried out? And then highlight gaseous exchange, right? So here we can use the acronym which I've introduced in the last video, SAMTB. It's very easy once you memorize this acronym because it can be applied to the four or five respiratory structures that we are discussing for the different organisms. It can be applied to all the organisms, right? For example, for the skin, we just use the M, moist, T, thin, and B, blood capillaries. All right. Now, first, the skin is moist to dissolve the respiratory gases. So how does the frog maintain a moist skin? It secretes mucus, right, which makes the skin moist while it is on land. So the skin needs to be moist in order to dissolve gases like oxygen before oxygen can diffuse into the blood capillaries underneath the skin. All right, we cannot see the blood capillaries here, but it's underneath the skin. Now, second adaptation is T, M then T. So T stands for thin. So the skin is thin. The layer of skin is very thin and highly permeable. That means allows the respiratory gases to diffuse quickly through it. All right. For respiratory gases to diffuse quickly through it. All right. So this is using the acronym T, thin. And lastly, the skin has a dense network of blood capillaries, so B. So underneath the skin here, it's not shown here, but underneath there's a dense network of blood capillaries to help transport the respiratory gases like oxygen from the skin to all the body cells, to the organs and body cells. Okay, so MTB. Now how about SA? SA stands for surface area, so it's not mentioned in your textbook. And nothing is mentioned about the surface area of the skin. But in some frogs, they do have folds, F-O-L-D-S, lipatan, to increase the surface area of the skin for faster gaseous exchange. You can add that down as an extra point later on. But mainly for textbook, they have these 3 points: moist, thin, and also having blood capillaries. All right. Now for lungs, we use the full acronym, SAMTB. Okay. So SA is for surface area. Now the lungs have a folded surface. So if we enlarge the lungs here now, this folded surface increases the total surface area of the lungs for faster gaseous exchange. Okay, so the surface is not flat like that or smooth. It is folded in, out like that. Okay, ada lipatan. And then the second point is the M, moist. So the lung walls are moist. Now you can see the blue layer here. This represents the fluid inside the lung. So it is moist. Okay, contains a little bit of fluid to dissolve the respiratory gases, which are oxygen. For example, oxygen has to dissolve in this layer first, the moisture in the lungs, and then it can then diffuse into the blood capillaries underneath the lining, okay, of the lungs. Okay, the third point is the T. All right, T. T stands for thin. So the lung membrane is very thin. All right, for quick diffusion of respiratory gases into the blood capillaries. And lastly, B is for blood capillaries. So you can see the red, the shaded area that's red here, right? So this represents the blood capillaries underneath the lining of the lungs. So the lungs have a dense network of blood capillaries to transport the respiratory gases. For example, transport oxygen to the cells. All right. So make use of the acronym. For skin is M, T, and B. Moist, thin, and having blood capillaries. For lungs is large surface area, moist, thin, and presence of blood capillaries. Okay. So here are the notes, the smart notes for what we discussed just now. It's the same thing, but it's in the form of explanations. And remember, you must have the fact leading to the explanation or the characteristic leading to the function. All right. So the first part here, like the skin is moist, this is the fact. And then to dissolve respiratory gases, this phrase that comes after the arrow is the function or the explanation for this fact. So in the exam, please don't use the arrows. Just omit all the arrows in the exam. That's all. So I put the arrows there to show you the two parts. So you must include the two parts in for each adaptation, or else you may not get your mark. Right? You must have the adaptation or the characteristic or the fact, and then followed by the explanation or the function of that characteristic. Okay? So you can copy these notes down in your notebook, as they are good notes. Now for humans. Now we come to humans. Right. Respiratory system is the human respiratory system, and the respiratory organs are the lungs. Now the respiratory structure are the little structures in the lungs called the alveoli, the little bags of air that contains air, right? Singular form is alveolus. So let's have a look at this diagram of the respiratory system of humans, all right? Pathway of air. So the oxygen in the air, how does it get into the lungs and into the alveoli? Firstly, we will breathe in the air through our nostrils, and then it will go into the trachea, which is the windpipe. And then trachea branches to form the two bronchi. Plural form is bronchi, but singular form is bronchus, right? These two Y-shaped branches here, okay, that branch out from the trachea. And then bronchi branch further, bronchus or bronchi branch further to form the bronchioles. And the bronchioles are in the lungs already, right? In the lungs. And then bronchioles will end in this alveoli, which are the air sacs or airbags. Okay, and alveoli are covered with a dense network of blood capillaries that allow the oxygen to diffuse into the blood, and then the blood capillaries contain blood that will transport the oxygen gas to the other tissues or to the other body cells. Okay, and carbon dioxide will be transported from the body cells to the alveolus to be excreted. Now, in the last video, part 1, we have already discussed this slide, but I'll just go through very briefly here. So it's interesting to note that as the organism gets more advanced or complex, as organisms get more advanced or more complex, they show more adaptations, all right, better adaptations for the various processes, like better adaptations to obtain oxygen from the environment. Okay, so for frog's lungs, they have the folded lining here that provide a larger surface area for faster diffusion of gases through the surface. For human lungs, it's even more complex and more advanced because we have these air sacs or airbags called alveoli, which actually, a pair of human lungs contains 700 million alveoli, so many alveoli, to produce a 70 meters squared of surface area. And then Each alveolus is covered by a fine network of blood capillaries covering 70% of its area. So all this is to increase the capacity of the organism to absorb or obtain more oxygen from the environment, and also to excrete more carbon dioxide. All right. So we should appreciate the complexity of the human lungs. All right, that help it to be able to efficiently obtain oxygen from the air. Right, so we're going to discuss the respiratory structure of the human respiratory system. What is our respiratory structure? What's the human respiratory structure? It is the alveoli, all right, found inside the lungs. So as we've discussed just now, for our respiratory system, first of all, we have the various structures here. Now the larynx is the voice box. Okay, so beneath here we have the trachea, which channels the oxygen or the air from the environment into the two branches here called each one is called a bronchus, so plural form is bronchi, right? And then each bronchus will branch out to form smaller branches called bronchioles. So the gray structures are the bronchioles, and they are in the lungs. Then at the end of the bronchioles are the alveoli, or air sacs or air bags, which are the respiratory structures in the human body. Okay, so the alveoli are covered in blood capillaries. Okay, the surface of the alveoli are covered with blood capillaries, and we have two colors here. The blue color denotes that the blood capillary contains deoxygenated blood. Okay, that's transported to the lungs from the heart, and then after oxygen has diffused into the blood from the alveoli, then here we have the oxygenated blood that is oxygenated and is denoted by the red color. Blood capillaries and blood vessels. Okay, all these contain the blood that is oxygenated. So if we look at this picture here, this shows a cross section of one alveolus. All right. So first of all, oxygen, air containing oxygen, is inhaled into the alveolus, and then it will diffuse from the alveolus through the wall of the alveolus, which is 1 cell thick, and through the wall of the blood capillary, which is also 1 cell thick, into the blood, and then it will combine with hemoglobin. Oxygen will combine with the hemoglobin and will be transported out of the lungs to the cells, okay, to the heart, and then it will be pumped, the blood will be pumped to the cells, right? So oxygenated blood we denote by the red color. These are the red blood cells, all right, that contain more oxygen. But the blood that is brought in contains less oxygen. It's called deoxygenated blood, denoted by the blue color, and contains a lot of carbon dioxide, which diffuses from the blood capillaries into the alveolus, and then after that it is exhaled out of the lungs. All right, so now we're going to discuss the adaptations of the alveolus to carry out gaseous exchange. Now here's an important question for the exam. What are the 4 adaptations of alveoli for efficient gaseous exchange? So very easy to answer this once you have this acronym SAMDB. All right. So SA stands for surface area. So the first point is that the human lungs contain a large number of alveoli to increase the total surface area for faster diffusion of gases or for faster gaseous exchange. Okay. And then M is for moist inner surface. So each alveolus has a moist inner surface, represented by the blue area here, to dissolve the respiratory gases such as oxygen. So oxygen needs to dissolve in the moisture before it can diffuse from the alveolus into the blood capillaries. Okay, so the moist inner surface, okay, is the second adaptation of each alveolus. Now thirdly, T is for thin wall. So alveolus has thin walls. An alveolus has a thin wall which is only 1 cell thick. Okay, now 1 cell thick wall here, for faster diffusion of respiratory gases, for example, so that faster and easier diffusion of respiratory gases. For example, oxygen just need to diffuse through one layer of cells, okay, of the alveolus, and also one layer of cells that is in the blood, that is found in the blood capillaries. Okay, so blood capillaries have also a thin wall, which is one cell thick only, right? So the oxygen will diffuse through these two layers of cells into the blood very easily, and then it will combine with hemoglobin in the red blood cells to be transported to the body cells. Okay, right. Next, so that's for thin wall. Next we have B for blood capillaries. So the alveolus or alveoli are covered by a dense network of blood capillaries, and this is blood capillaries is for faster diffusion and also transport of the respiratory gases. Okay, so this is the blood capillary surrounding the alveolus. Right, so that's how we can answer this question, the 4 adaptations of alveoli for faster gaseous exchange. All right, remember SAM-TB. All right, so these are the notes for the human respiratory structure and its adaptations. So the human respiratory structure is the alveolus, not the lungs. Okay, don't write down respiratory structure is the lungs. Wrong. It is the structure inside the lungs that carry out the gaseous exchange, and these are the air sacs or air bags called the alveoli or the alveolus, which has the characteristics of for efficient gaseous exchange of respiratory gases, which are oxygen and carbon dioxide. Right? So the 4 adaptations of alveoli, we already discussed this. Large total surface area, the SA, for faster diffusion of respiratory gases. M for moist, inner surface of alveolus is moist to dissolve oxygen, so that it can diffuse through the walls into blood capillaries. T is for thin, the wall of the alveolus is thin, only one cell thick, for faster and easier diffusion of respiratory gases. And B is for blood capillaries. The alveolus is covered or surrounded by a large or a dense network of blood capillaries for faster diffusion and transport of respiratory gases. Okay, so remember, I must have the fact, which is the first part, and then leading to the explanation, which is the second part after the arrow. Okay, then omit all these arrows when you are writing in the exam, when you're writing the essay answers in the exam. So we have already discussed the respiratory structures of the various organisms. In conclusion, if we are asked to explain the 4 adaptations of the respiratory structures of different organisms, we can use the acronym SAM-TB. All right, so this is just a quick reminder here. Now, SA stands for surface area, so usually there are a large number of the respiratory structures like alveoli or tracheoles and so forth to provide a large surface area for efficient exchange of respiratory gases. And then usually the respiratory structure has a moist inner surface, or the wall of the respiratory structure is moist to dissolve the respiratory gases like oxygen before oxygen can diffuse into the body, okay, into the blood capillaries, for example, or into the cells. Now, thirdly, the respiratory structures have thin walls, which are, for example, for alveolus is only one cell thick, the wall here, right, for faster diffusion of respiratory gases. And fourthly, there are a lot of blood capillaries. This is not true for insects, so insects are an exception. So for fish, frogs, and humans, right, there are a lot of blood capillaries in the respiratory structure or underneath the lining of the respiratory structures for efficient transport of respiratory gases, right? For example, there are a lot of blood capillaries surrounding the alveolus, right? Or alveoli for efficient transport. So blood capillaries are for transport of respiratory gases. Now for insects, they don't have these blood capillaries to transport the oxygen. For example, because in the tracheoles, the oxygen will diffuse directly from the tracheoles into the body cells. So there's no blood capillary or no blood. Blood is not involved to transport the respiratory gases. Now here is a common question that's been asked in the SPM exam before, so please take note. Compare and contrast the respiratory structures in humans and animals. 10 marks. Now normally you will be asked to compare the respiratory structures in only 2 organisms. So it could be comparing the respiratory structures in a frog and a human being, or a fish and an insect and so forth. Okay, so there are some similarities and some differences. So for comparison questions, please write down both the similarities and also differences. So let's look at the 4 similarities. It's based on our acronym SAMTB. All right. So number 1, all respiratory structures have a large total surface area to volume ratio for efficient exchange or diffusion of respiratory gases. We're using the SA here, which stands for surface area, a large surface area or large total surface area to volume ratio. All right. For example, the respiratory structures like the alveoli. There are lots of these alveoli, a large number of alveoli to increase the total surface area. So that is very large, right? And also you can see for the fish, it has a lot of gill filaments to increase the total surface area, and a lot of lamellae also to increase the total surface area. Same for tracheoles. There's a large number of tracheoles to increase the total surface area, right? For efficient exchange of respiratory gases. Now, all respiratory structures are moist to dissolve respiratory gases. So the M stands for moist. So this is true for tracheoles, which have moisture at the tips of the tracheole to dissolve the oxygen gas before it diffuses into the cells. Now, for fish, it's already living in water, so this fact may not be so relevant, that the respiratory surfaces are moist to dissolve respiratory gases, because the oxygen is already dissolved inside the water, and the fish extracts the oxygen from the water. Okay, so it may not be relevant for fish. You say that the fish has a respiratory structure that is moist. Now, for frogs, of course, the lungs, the inner surface is moist here to dissolve the respiratory gases, and same for alveoli. Okay, the inner surface is moist. Now, all respiratory structures have thin walls for faster diffusion of respiratory gases. Okay, for example, tracheoles have thin walls. Gill filaments here have thin walls, right? And the frog's lungs here, it has thin walls, and so does the skin. There's thin walls. The layer of the skin, all right, is very thin, so that the oxygen can diffuse into the skin easily. And same for alveoli. Alveoli, they have a wall that's only 1 cell thick, right? For faster diffusion of respiratory gases. Now, respiratory structures have dense networks of blood capillaries, except in insects, all right, for efficient transport of respiratory gases. So you can see that in the fish, the gill filament, there is a dense network of blood capillaries in the gill filaments. Also, underneath the skin of the frog and in the lungs, okay, in the wall of the lungs, there's a dense network of blood capillaries, and also surrounding the alveoli. Now, insects, they don't have these blood capillaries, all right, for transport of respiratory gases, because the oxygen diffuses from the tracheoles directly into the body cells. All right. So the use of the dense network of blood capillaries is for efficient transport of respiratory gases. Now, so there are 4 similarities, okay, based on SAMTB. Now let's look at the 4 differences. So the 4 differences are, for the 2 differences here are related to the respiratory structures of the organisms and how the large total surface area to volume ratio is achieved for the respiratory structure. So different organisms have different respiratory structures. For insects, the respiratory structure is called the tracheole, as you can see here, right? So imagine that this structure looks a bit like a hand, right, with the fingers here, right? Just imagine to be like that. So this main tube is called the trachea, and then it branches out to form many tracheoles which are in contact with the cells. So the tracheole is the respiratory structure where gaseous exchange occur between the cells and the tracheole. Now, for fish, the respiratory structure are the gill filaments. So these are the gill filaments. Okay, the tiny structures that are like V-shaped like that. These are the gill filaments. And on the gill filaments, there are lamella, right? These folds that further increase the surface area of the gill filaments. All right. Then for frogs, their respiratory structures are the skin on the whole body of the frog, and the lungs, which have folds here. Okay, but the lungs are quite simple compared to human lungs. Now for humans, the respiratory structure is called the alveolus or alveoli, okay, which are tiny air sacs. right, to allow gaseous exchange between the environment, between the air and the blood, right? The blood in the blood capillaries. Okay, how is the large, number 2, how is the large total surface area to volume ratio for the respiratory structure? How is it achieved? So how large total surface area to volume ratio, or just how large total surface area is achieved for the respiratory structure? So for insects, they have a large number of these tracheoles. Okay, these tube-like structures called the tracheoles. For fish, they have a large number of filaments, these structures, and lamellae, which are the folds found on the filaments, to further increase the surface area of the respiratory structure, to further increase the surface area of the filaments. Now, for frogs, they have folded lungs, lungs with folds. Lungs with folds. So the surface of the lungs is folded like this. It's not very complex, not as complex as in humans. And the overall skin surface also adds to the surface area. Okay, so sometimes, as I said, some of the frogs have skins that are in folds to increase the surface area. Now for humans, we have a large number of alveoli, and that effectively increases the surface area to a very big value, right? 70 meters squared, around there, for both lungs. So these are the differences. So it depends on which organism you are comparing. Sometimes in the exam they may ask you to compare insects with fish, or fish with frogs, or frogs with humans, or fish with humans, and so forth. Alright, so you can select according to what the characteristic of the respiratory structure is. If insects are involved, you must take note that there's a difference. Insects do not have a dense network of blood capillaries for transport of respiratory gases. Okay. So this is the end of this video. Now in the next video, I will give you some questions, very good questions, for you to test yourself on chapter or subtopic 8.1. And then we will be also going on to other subtopics of chapter 8. So thanks for viewing, and please do share, like, and subscribe. Until we meet again, goodbye.